Trade goods. There's a bunch of them, and it's time to rank them in the only objective way possible, a tier list. We'll be taking into account as many things as possible into this ranking, including things like how easy are the manufactories for these trade goods to be built, and in the case of things such as state houses, whether those manufactories perform better on them. The trade goods below, that's these ones here, are actually listed in the order they appear in the game files, so there's no inherent bias there. As for the tiers, S tier, that's the top one here, is going to be for the trade goods that are playthrough defining, namely you can play a whole game around them. A tier trade goods are just your really strong trade goods, top of the line stuff. B trade goods are the solid, decent trade goods that do their jobs, and you're never sad when you see them. C is the trade goods. Pretty much most things that I'll be putting here are not the worst ones, but they can definitely be better, and if you're rolling the trade goods by colonizing, there's better ones to find. With D, however, being the worst trade goods. This is where I'm going to put trade goods where if I'll be sad when I roll them during colonization, and trade goods that are very much filler, aka for some trade good to be good, other trade goods need to be bad. These are the bad ones. I will be taking into account price change events, modifiers, and the time value function of money, namely that money early is a lot better than money later, significantly better. But one thing I will not be taking into account here is any mission that may increase the value of a trade good. This is meant to be an everyone list, and if you're playing as a Congo, I doubt it's very much interested you that Poland has a mission that increases the price of grain, a mission the DI never pops anyway, so you should be happy about your grain provinces. Those kind of missions, I believe, are best viewed as a buff to their local countries, instead of something you should bear in mind while planning all of your playthroughs. Another thing that's also an important distinction to make is that I'm going to be assuming that you are going for the, if you're playing a single player, you're going for the world conquest as fast as possible. So that means you need money to take loans, you need money to build your manufactories, build your state houses, fund your armies. And if you're playing multiplayer, then you need money to fight all the other players. So either way, the value of these trade goods and the function they provide are going to be viewed in the context of a playthrough where you're either going to conquer the world where you need the resources, or it's going to be viewed in the context of you playing multiplayer where you need the money and manpower or whatever you get out of those provinces to help you achieve your goals and fighting the other players. This means that if you're going into this from the point of view of playing EU4 of, oh, I think England looks interesting, I'm going to go play England for their mission tree, you're probably going to disagree with some of these claims on the tier list. Namely, you're probably also not going to be playing that late, we're talking past 1700s, so things like coal and other trade goods that are excelling in the later game are going to be valued a lot lower by you. That's something to bear in mind. I'm going to be assuming you're playing until 1821, and I'm going to be assuming that you're playing the game as optimally as possible. With all that said and done, let's begin. Okay, so first things first before we begin, the starting price of the average trade good is 3.3 ducats. That takes into account of what the average trade good price is. However, another thing that's important to bear in mind is the distribution of trade goods. Your high value trade goods, your ivories, your silks, your dyes, are a lot rarer than things like fur or fish. That means that, in general, that's going to be artificially increasing the average price. From my personal view or understanding, is anything that's 3 ducats or above is reasonable, and anything below 3 ducats is kind of bad in terms of its pure trade value for money generation. Once the game progresses, prices tend to, on average, go up, but not by that much, and some trade goods actually fall in value. What that means is by the end of the game, we're talking 1820 with all temporary modifiers already taken into account. We're looking at 3.87, 58333333 recurring average trade value of a province. Sorry, of a trade good. In practice, that means that you can realistically put a 3.7, even a 3.5 by end of the game for average trade good value. This also does not take into account gold, which I think is an important distinction to make. And gold, again, is very much the special poster child of the trade good world, and it operates on its own and does its own thing. With that all being said and done, let's begin with the tier list, and we're going to start looking at cloth. Right, so the first trade good we're taking a look at is cloth. Cloth starts at a trade value of 3 ducats and ends at 4.05. It's available at Tech 11 for this manufactory, and it provides dev costs for the province modifier and merc maintenance for the overall modifier. Cloth is honestly an all-around good trade good to have. 10% dev cost means that it's an excellent trade good to have if you ever want to dev an institution for single player, or in multiplayer it just helps you dev where you squeeze out every point of development, nothing there to complain. Merc maintenance tends to be a bit of a weird one. You tend to not use mercenaries that late anyway, but when you do, it helps you use them more effectively, aka cheaper. It's also just a decent trade good for money, at 3 ducats, and it's never a bad thing to find inside any of your runs, I find. For that reason alone, and because I tend to value dev costs more than the average person, I'm going to be putting cloths in A tier. Okay, let's now move on to fish. Starts at 2.5 ducats and it doesn't get better. It ends up at 2 ducats. It gets its manufacture at 11 for what it's worth, but again, you're building a manufacturer in a 2.5 to 2 trade good. You get some local sailors and global sailors, sorry, out of fish, which is nice. But at the end of the day, you're not really ever short on sailors, I find. From personal experience in multiplayer, naval battles aren't really decided by who has the most sailors, they're decided by who has the higher quality more than anything. And you don't really tend to get long drawn-out naval battles, they normally decided into 3 to 4 engagements, tops. In single player as well, the best way to get sailors for doing things like invading England is just by getting large, and you tend to get enough sailors that way in single player as well. In essence, you end up with an awful combination of a trade good with low trade value that decreases in trade value and provides pretty much useless province and trading in buffs. For that reason, fish is going to be the first thing we have in D tier. Next, we move on to fur. Fur is an interesting one. It starts at 2 ducats and hits 3.5. If you take into account the Little Ice Age, then actually you see that fur will hit 4 ducats, which is certainly very impressive, but 3.5 is also very respectable. Now, the manufacturing tech for fur is a bit later. It's at tech 14, which is later than some of the other manufacturers get access to. But at least it has some okay-ish bonuses. It provides you 10% trade power per province, which means if you have fur on something that has a high amount of base trade power, like an estuary, it becomes quite nice. Normally that only applies in places like Canada. And also another place with a lot of fur is Russia. So if you play in Russia, you're going to have access to a lot of fur, so you'll be able to get a bit more trade power to contest it from the Chinese or anyone else in Siberia that's stealing the trade power from you. The thing, though, with that trade power is 10% trade power doesn't make too much of a difference anyway overall. It's just a nice small thing to have, and it's certainly not a useless modifier, but it's not great. And the same can be said for the trading end modifier. 0.5 prestige is nice. And I can see the appeal of it in multiplayer as well, if you're ever in a position where you need more prestige to disinherit your rulers or things like that. But in single player, I find that when you're doing a world conquest, you tend to conquer a bunch of monuments, and when you have enough money, you can upgrade them. And one thing that a lot of monuments have is the Yeti prestige increases. So that fur just kind of ends up supplementing the Yeti prestige increases you get from monuments. So while it's not a useless modifier, it's just okay. And I think fur in that way is a very good example of a just okay trade book. Good. It becomes eventually reasonable at 3.5, but for me, the low starting price and the reasonable, not nice buffs in the provinces and trading in buffs means that fur firmly for me sits in C tier. Now we move on to grain. Now, technically I've seen all people refer to this as wheat, it's grain, and the reason it's actually grain is that so Paradox doesn't have to add a rice trade good. If you take a look at China, you'll see that a large part of it is covered in wheat as well. Well, grain to be clear. However, it's not wheat, it's rice, and since rice is a grain, then the grain trade good is a good indicator for it. Grain starts at 2.5 trade price, which is below average, but it's not great. But it actually ends up dropping to 2, which is also not amazing. Grain isn't really a manufacturer you build for the money, that is there for certain. However, it has a couple other things going for it in terms of the utility department. If you are going for the early manufacturer, you're able to get it by Admin Tech 6, which is excellent to be honest. One of the earliest manufacturing trade goods. But you're better off building soldiers' households on it for getting you extra manpower. That manpower is useful in single player if you're fighting a lot of rebels or you're trying to do your world conquest fast and you need more men in the field. And this is where grain combos really well with its per province and trading in buffs. Per province, it gives you 0.5 force limit, meaning that if you have a lot of grain provinces, you're going to quickly start getting a lot of force limit. This means countries that tend to have a lot of grain, either Russia that tends to conquer into Ruthenia, which has a lot of grain provinces in Poland, or countries like Poland that start with those grain provinces, or countries like China that have a lot of those trade provinces, get disproportionately larger force limits than they should have, because they're getting that 0.5 force limit per trade good. And that starts to add up pretty quickly when you're looking at 20, 30 of these. Furthermore, an important thing to remember, it's base force limit, which means any percentage modifiers from quantity stack really well with grain. The trading end buff is just wonderful. It's one of the better trading end buffs in my opinion. It's 20% force limit. In multiplayer, there's no reason to explain why 20% force limit is great. It means you just have a 20% larger army you can field without spending extra money on it. And in single player, one of the best hegemons, well, arguably the best hegemon to go for is the military hegemon. That requires you having 1 million men in the field. Quite expensive unless you have a lot of force limit going for you, and that's where grain has got you covered. With 20% force limit increases, you're going to be a lot easier for you to grab the military hegemon. However, grain still has a couple problems with it. At the end of the day, it's still a pretty terrible trade good. At 2.5 ducats and dropping down to 2, it's just sad. So with that being said, unfortunately I can't rank grain higher than C tier. There's just better things to get. After grain, we move on to livestock, that's your cows. Now, livestock's an interesting one. It starts at 2, which is lower than 2.5, but it does actually increase up to 3.4, which is very respectable. But however, those increases happen very late into the game. We're talking the selective breeding events, and those are happening well into the Enlightenment, so we're talking near the sunset, the end parts of the game, at which point money again is much less of a concern in the early game. The manufactory for cows again is quite early at admin 6, however I'd also recommend building Soldier's Household on cows. With that being said, the per province modifier on cows is just the most whatever modifier out there, 50% supply limit. Great. The only time I've ever looked for cows to get more supply limit is been when there was when I was getting the achievement to get a high level fort on a province with cows to and build a supply depot on them to get a very well supplied fort. Outside of that achievement, I've never looked for cows for a local supply limit. The issue with 50% supply limit as a modifier is if it was given on a global level, that would be amazing. It would be, honestly, going up at least 2 tiers from that alone. Because that means that every single place where you're fighting, you're getting a lot less, well, you're getting a lot more supply for your entire army. 50% local supply suffers from the issue that the army that's standing in the province is fine. But if you want to move it, you're then going to have to go back to not having that 50% supply limit. And that's just going to hurt you, give your attrition back, etc, etc. In general, if you want to optimally drill, I guess you can go drill on cows, but realistically, that's such a marginal application, I can't really mark it as useful in my mind. The global buff for trading in cows is minus 10% cav cost. That's a bit more reasonable, a bit more usable. The issue is that if you're stacking cav costs, there's a lot of things in the base game, and an MP as well, that tend to give you those cavalry cost reductions. So 10% cav cost, while it would stack with it rather nicely, in my experience, I find that you either are running a lot of cav, in which case you're worrying about cav costs, so you have a lot of the cav costs there already. You end up hitting the 100% cav cost reduction, well, it's 90% cav cost reduction cap, if you tend to stack it. If you're doing a Secrada build, or you're doing a Horde, that already gets like 25%, etc, etc. So that 10% trading in livestock cows tends to not have much of an effect. Or you tend to not be doing that. You tend to not be using cavalry, you're just conquering the world, in which case you're probably not using cavalry. In essence, the trade good becomes okay late game on the trade value. It's still below average on the final trade value for the record. So, but it's late game money when it's less important. Early game is terrible. Early game is terrible for supply limit. Early game is terrible for most things. The only saving grace is you can build the you can build the manpower manufacturer on it. Beyond that, it's really not great. And I'll be honest, simply because there's a lot of just better triggers out there, I'm going to have you putting cows in it D tier. Whew. Now, naval supplies. Naval supplies starts at 2 ducats and ends up at 3. Great. The manufacturing for naval supplies requires Tech 11, so that's that. It's not a late manufacturer, it's not an early manufacturer, it's pretty much near the middle. The per province buff of naval supplies is naval force limit, and the global trading in buff is naval force limit percentage. Great. Unless you're going for naval hegemon, which most of the time you're not, it's not really useful. If you are going for naval hegemon, you tend to be a person who's quite rich and is just grabbing the third hegemon after the other 2 players in MP grab the other 2 just to have a hegemon, in which case you could probably afford to go with force limit. You're never really in need of naval force limit compared to any other things, and naval force limit percentage buffs, again, you're getting a pretty substantial buff to something you don't tend to use, which isn't great. You're constantly subpar below on the trade values, trading it 2 and then trading it 3 eventually. I mean, all around, just bad things to say about naval supplies. So for that reason, it's another very comfortable D tier. Salt. So salt starts at 3 ducats, which is just below average, and it ends up going to 3.3. Again, just below average. It's okay. If you take into account the weighted average of the provinces, 3 ducats per trade good is what you're about expecting to get. The manutech for it is again also pretty average. In fact, so far with salt, we're seeing just the average trade good. On that point of view, however, we start to get some nice per province modifiers. If you are building some nice forts, I would recommend keeping an eye out for salt, because that 15% defensiveness does add up. That means that your forts are going to be able to last just that little bit longer and can help you win the siege race, win the defense of it, and so on and so on. So the per province modifier I actually tend to find useful both in single player, where I'm just trying to build a couple of decent forts around my country so that rebels don't tend to break me that much, or I try to build forts so that when I inevitably end up fighting that same country 15 times over, it doesn't siege out me that much, and that's where salt helps. But the global trading in buff of -5 land maintenance is just nice. You pretty much always have an army, whatever setup you're doing, whatever you're playing the game, unless you're doing a no army challenge, you're going to have an army, and -5 land maintenance is going to save you 5% on that army. The army tends to be one of the most expensive things you're going to get in this game, if not the most expensive, and you're saving 5% on your largest expense. It's just all around nice. In essence, it's quite the average trade good, but its position in B tier is thoroughly solidified by its quite nice both province and trading buffs. Nothing game breaking, but again, it's just a consistently nice trade good. So into the middle of B tier you go. Wine. Starting at 2.5 ducats, below average, and ending very well below average as well at 3.125 ducats, we have wine. Wine again is an Admintech 6 farm estate manufactory, so you can get your manufactories from wine earlier. However, you probably shouldn't. That being said and done, wine does get -1 unrest on the province level and -1 global unrest on a global level. That -1 global unrest can be kind of nice if you're ever, worried about your single-player rebels rising up, but I tend to find when I'm conquering the world, I tend to be so overextended that -1 global unrest doesn't end up doing too much. However, if you are going for unrest stacking, it's something you should bear in mind, and you can also get modifiers about the fine vintage as well for -1 unrest, so that's good there. The per province reduction also isn't awful, but it can be a lot better. Wine is mainly held back with just how low trade value it actually is. I mean, you would have thought that with the price that some wines are getting today, it'll be valuing a bit more than at the 3.125 eventually. But that's just the reality that we live in. It's a subpar trade good with meh modifiers. It can be situationally useful, and honestly, the price of it isn't that awful. And for that reason, I'm going to be putting wine in C tier. Wool. Pretty much wine, but it comes from sheep. At 2.5 ducats starting and ending at 2.875, and bear in mind that final price increase is from selected breeding, so quite a bit later. In fact, it takes a decrease from 2.5 down to 2. With a manu attack of 11, it's just not great. You get a local movement speed reduction for your friendly troops. What an amazing modifier. I can enter my own provinces faster. Woo, let's go. I was really looking forward to that. And it's only slightly held back from being abysmal by the -5% ship cost reduction you get from trading it. Otherwise, it's just all around bad. Wool is actually why I'm going to break one of my earlier rules about not mentioning other mission trees, and I'm going to bring up the Polish Commonwealth missions. Poland has a mission where they're able to replace all of the wool provinces into cloth. So if you ever have a burning, passionate hatred for wool that has been inspired by me just revealing how awful it is at trade good, go ahead and play the Commonwealth, conquer the entire world, and then press that mission. Because that scope hasn't actually got a limit. It will convert every single wool province out there, from Cathay down to Ireland, into cloth, which is just objectively better, from every single point. So there you go. If you really want to get rid of wool, you can. However, otherwise, it's just sad. It's a filler trade good. It's not good for money. It's not good for pretty much anything. And -5% ship cost. I mean, again, it gives you -5 ship cost, which also decreases your naval maintenance. But in general, if you're building a big navy, you're probably doing that because you can afford it. 5% ship cost isn't going to be doing too much there for you. So for that reason alone, it sits comfortably in D tier. Now we move on to copper. So copper starts at 3 ducats. It jumps up pretty quickly from bronze cannons in the early game to be quite valuable, and that reason alone, I'm going to value it a bit higher than the 3 ducats will initially reveal. But it's not going to stay that way. With cast iron cannons coming along, it's going to knock copper back down to its endgame price of 3.5 ducats. Still respectable, never a bad trade good at any point during that exchange, but it's not anything too amazing. Again, it's only amazing for a very small period between bronze cannons and iron cannons. The per province modifier is -20% local recruitment time. Situation that can be nice. I would say that if you're playing the game super optimally, you'd recruit your merc stacks in a copper province. Otherwise, it's kind of whatever. Normally, you have some copper provinces surrounded by not copper provinces, so when you queue up a large army, the copper provinces finish, and then you're still waiting for the other provinces to finish building their troops. So that -20% local recruitment time isn't as big of a deal as it would be. Otherwise, it would be nice to save some time recruiting. But that's what the trading in buffs for -20% global recruitment time actually come in. Doesn't mean they can raise your armies a bit faster. It's a quality of life feature, realistically. Very few times I've been in a situation where if I'd had my army out a month before so I could recover morale, it would have changed the outcome of a battle or anything. That pretty much never happens. You need to make up a scenario for that to occur. but it's still a nice quality of life thing for it to be there. Copper is very solid. It gets its value quite early in the game when it's more important, and then it drops down to a more respectable 3.45. It's an excellent workhorse modifier, and for that reason alone, copper sits comfortably in B tier. Now we move on to iron. Iron also starts at 3, however it ends at 4.5, a bit more flashy than its copper cousin. The Manutech, much like for copper, is also 11. I did not mention that for copper. It's 11. Iron gives you minus 20% local construction time, which is nice. Construction time is a bit more useful than army time, because in general, if you queue up a large stack of, let's say you queue up 20k troops, your one regiment is finished on the copper province. That one regiment is still waiting around for all the other regiments to finish and then regain morale before it can do anything. With iron, let's say you've just got the new workshop tech, so you queue up workshops in all across your country. The iron provinces are going to finish 20% faster, which means that those workshops are going to be up 20% faster. Not 20%, it's not quite how percentage, so they are going to be done with, well, 20% low construction time in mind. But that means that while those workshops are active and the other ones have not been finished, they are still going to be producing you that money. So that minus 20% low construction time I'm going to value a bit more than local regiment recruitment time. It actually does make a significantly more impactful difference. However, at the end of the day, unless you're building manufactories, 20% local construction time isn't that big of a deal, so it's not anything to write home about. It's just noticeable is the best way of putting it. The trading in buff is minus 5 regiment cost. To be clear, minus 5 regiment cost is basically the same as minus 5 land maintenance, but slightly better, as regiment cost also decreases your land maintenance. It depends on what you're stacking. If you have let's say you have minus 90% land maintenance, to go from 90 to minus 95, that minus 5 land maintenance reduction is in essence another 50% jump. But if you have 0 regiment cost and you go to minus 5 regiment cost, that's only a minus 5 jump, so it depends on what modifier you end up stacking. But that minus 5 regiment cost, you normally end up picking some regiment costs around anyway, so it's never exactly wasted, and worst comes to worst, it's just minus 5 reduction in one of your largest expenses, which is just nice. For that reason, iron, I think, is also a very comfortable D tier sitter. I'm going to be putting it above copper if you're looking at that from a more point of view, and both of them above salt, since I think iron is probably slightly better than copper. However, it's not significantly better, and I think iron being in B tier is an excellent way of looking at it all around. And after that, we move on to the poster child of the weird, unique trade good, gold. Now, gold doesn't have a value. It has a value of 0 because it doesn't produce any local trade value, which is good, because if gold was actually coded as having a trade value, as in the effective trade value of gold, its trade value would be 40. However, don't be disproportional. 40 is an amazing amount of trade value to have, but there is a problem with it. You can't affect it by production efficiency. With workshops having massive increase to production efficiency and a lot of things in the game also giving you access to production efficiency, from ideas to policies to, well, missions, not being affected by production efficiency holds back that 40 value quite a bit. Gold has no province modifiers, no trading in buffs, and doesn't have a manufactory, so again, it's very hard to judge it on that note. However, it's 40 ducats, and it's 40 ducats when you need it, usually in the early game. Gold is a trade good you can build your country around. But again, it suffers from a lot of poster child drawbacks. It can deplete, so if you're being too dependent on it, you might just have your economy halve if it depletes, or not half, but significantly decrease. And since that is pretty random, it's quite a bad thing to have your gold mines deplete in the middle of a war when you really need the money. The other thing with gold is it gives you a lot of inflation that can start really eating into your income otherwise. And in late game, when you start getting your trade value and you really get your trade going, and that's where you start to really make the money, gold does not produce any trade value. And that's another thing that's kind of holding gold back. So while it's just a genuinely amazing trade good to get early, it's great to scale early, it's good to use your gold income to invest in other non-gold based things to produce your value. My issue with gold is just how much it technically falls off by the late game with its lack of trade production, and just how many other things I need to do when I'm running around gold. I need to worry about inflation from it, I need to worry about it depleting, it's good, but it needs a lot of maintenance. For that tier, I'm going to put it for that reason, I'm going to put it just short of S tier, and I'm going to put it at the top of A tier. With gold being done, we move on to ivory. Ivory starts at 3 ducats, so already decent, and goes up to 4.5. Its Manutac is 11, which is reasonable. Oh, sorry, I was reading the iron category, my bad. You can scratch that entirely. I was like, wait, I remember ivory being a lot better. With that being said, we move on to ivory. Ivory starts at 4 ducats and ends up at 5. It only ever goes up in price, and that makes sense. Ivory is probably one of the nicest trade goods, if not the nicest trade goods to find in Africa outside of gold. It starts a consistently good trade value of 4. It only goes up in price. The manufacturing tech for it, 14, isn't that far off. Normally by the time you're colonizing, again, in the early stages of your colonization, you don't have that much money, so you can't really afford manufacturers on them. But it's just consistently nice there. The local state maintenance on ivory is weird. Normally you're trade companying the ivory, for lack of a better word, so decreasing state maintenance on it does pretty much nothing. The other problem with decreasing state maintenance is you're decreasing something that's going to cost you like 20 ducats when you conquer the entire world. So a 20% local state maintenance on a modifier that isn't that substantial is kind of whatever. So the actual performance modifier is pretty negligible. What is, however, not negligible is the trading in buff. +2 dip rep is just nice. Even in multiplayer, when that +2 dip rep goes a long way, it helps you annex your vassals faster, and that's actually pretty much it. In single player, however, dip rep makes your diplomacy easier with everyone else, so before you get a hegemon, that matters. And again, it helps you annex your vassals, which you tend to have even more of in single player. Certainly, the dip rep goes a lot further in single player than in multiplayer, there's no denying that, but it's also just a nice thing to have in multiplayer as well. Again, for annexing your vassals. 4 value, again, gently above average. 5 value at the end, again, good above average. Just a consistently good trade good. And consistently trade good is how you get yourself into 18. With that being said, we move on to one of the other 2 trade goods we find in Africa by the bucket load. Slaves. And this one, I'm not going to be nice towards. It's awful. You start at 2 ducats. Then Portugal is going to invent triangles and it's going up to 3. And then we're going to get this abolitionism movement in the late game, and it's going to go down to 2.2. In fact, abolitionism existing is the only reason that slaves isn't just the worst thing to find, because at least with abolitionism you can get rid of slaves, and get a nicer trade good like ivory instead. The manufacturing for slaves is a what's it called? The trade thing, at tech 14. Gives you a missionary strength. It's not awful in a local province, but the thing is, with a missionary strength local modifier, is you are either going for the 1 faith, in which case you're converting everyone, in which case you've stacked missionary strength, in which case plus 1 missionary strength is not going to matter when you already have 15 on the province. Or you haven't stacked missionary strength, in which case you're either going for a humanist build where you're not converting anyone anyway. And if you are converting but without religious ideas and missionary strength stacking, slaves tend to be found in the least devved provinces in the game, which means you don't really have a lot of development to fight against, as it were. That plus 1 missionary strength is just marginally slightly nicer. Like, it's not useless. It's just not useful either, like, at all, really. You have to think of very specific marginal cases where it makes a difference, or unless you're stacking missionary strengths for some obscure challenge. Otherwise, it's whatever. You're consistently below average on the trade value price. You end up going to 3 after Portugal invents triangles, but again, most of your slaves are coming from Africa, where there's better trade goods. And there's also a slave province in Crimea, in Azov. But again, that one's a bit of a weird one, considering it's surrounded by things like wheat and livestock, so it's not like there's better things around it. Regardless, it's just not good. And the 25% global tariffs trading buff, while global tariffs became a bit more useful, they used to be completely useless, which made slaves entirely useless all the way around. Now, if you're going for a colonial empire, that 25% global tariffs, if you're stacking it as an England run, it can be reasonable. But really, if you're going for a global empire in the weirdest case possible, you probably have enough money. You have these massive colonies, you're making these buffs, you're probably looking for things like 20% force limit more than you're looking at things like 25% more tariffs, unless you're doing some weird challenge to back income. In which case, sure, it's fine, but from a conventional want to conquer the world, something like 20% force limit is going to be a lot more useful to you than 25% global tariffs, since that gives you more money when you're already rich, as in not caring about money as much. And that's the thing with slaves, it's just not good all around. Honestly, slaves to me are a disappointment whenever I see them, because it could have been something like ivory, and instead I'm stuck with them. So for that, slaves are a very firm D tier. Now we move on to China, where it starts at 3 and ends at 3. It does go up in price for a bit and then goes back down, so it's not like it's at 3 forever. It's okay when you're playing in China or Japan or Korea and have access to it. It's a reasonable trade good, so there's nothing to complain about it to there. It gives you minus 0.1 local autonomy decrease, which means that in the super early game, when you've usually got rid of your crown land and you're conquering very quickly and trying to recover it, the very early phase of the game where you have decreases to your local autonomy, increase to your local autonomy from lack of crown land is going to be nice to counteract that. Otherwise, it's whatever. It's just a nice thing to have. It's a, well, quality of life thing, for lack of a better word, because it's local autonomy, not global. The other thing to bear in mind with it is that trading in it buff is either 0.25 yellow legitimacy or whatever you end up using. If you're a Horde, then it's Horde Unity, that kind of stuff. And if you're a Republic, then it's 0.12 Republican tradition. You do get Republican tradition legitimacy, which is nice. You just don't get a lot of it, and I think that's the issue. It's just a nice quality of life thing all around. And it's never a bad trade good, it never goes too low. It's not something like Grain, where it's just carried out by its side abilities. It's just a consistently average trade good, and I think for that reason I'm going to be putting in B tier. Next we have Spices. Spices, again, consistently okay on the value front. 3 ducats goes to 3.3 after a bit of jumping around. The manufacturing for it is 14. By the way, the Chinaware manufacturing is 16, so it's a bit of a late manufacturing as well, but whatever. Now, Spices gives you minus 0.1 monthly devastation. However, if you don't have devastation, that does literally nothing, so congratulations. The other thing with it is that when you're trading in it, you're getting 25% spy defense. If someone's spying on you, Spices is nice. If you have devastation, Spices is nice. However, for 90% of the time, if not more, if not 95% of the time, Spices are going to be doing literally nothing for you because no one's going to be spying on you and the province is not going to be devastated, which means it's going to be looking at purely just the value of it. And the value of it is okay. Technically below average, but it's not too far below, and you're still better off than a lot of the 2.5s to trade goods. It's just a meh one. It's bottom of B tier, if that, if not C tier as well. Next, we move on to Tea. Now, this might be a bit more controversial. People tend to probably like Tea for its trading in buff. Tea starts at 2 ducats and goes to 3, so it's just consistently bad for its value. It provides 25% garrison growth, so if you're ever building a fort on it and then you stop paying for forts and then start paying for it again, it'll recover the garrison faster. Great. What an amazing modifier. The thing to bear in mind, of course, is that if an AI captures that fort, or a player captures that fort, that 25% garrison growth is going to help them recover the garrison in your fort faster as well, because it gives you 25% garrison growth on the province, not just friendly garrison growth. So it's a bit of a double-edged sword, but the thing is, it's kind of not really a double-edged sword, it's more of a double-edged stick. It doesn't really do much. You're either going to be assaulting the fort immediately after it's been retaken, in which case, great, you've recovered 120 men instead of 100. Woo, you did it. Actually, that specific breakpoint is important, because if you're on 100, you probably should assault. Wait a day, take them attrition, go down to 99, because the 99 is an automatic win. But great, you've recovered 240 instead of 200 manpower. I'm still going to be assaulting that and killing you immediately. So it's not much of a modifier there. It's consistently below you on the starting price and the final price. But the reason that people are probably going to find this placement controversial is going to be the minus 10% advisor cost. And it's good. Advisor cost is good. Let's be very clear about it. 10% advisor cost is good. It stacks very well with everything around you. There's a bunch of monuments that give it to you, and so on and so on. My issue with Tea giving you advisor cost, making it get ranked higher, is where most Tea is found. Namely China. The thing with China is that you get a bunch of advisor cost anyway from all your other things. In fact, is China able to hit something like 140% advisor cost while not going for stacking advisor cost? So, realistically, that minus 10 advisor cost ends up being useless because you're hitting the cap. I mean, I was playing a game as Korea, just as a friendly with a couple friends, and I managed to get like minus 90% advisor cost as Korea. Granted, I was stacking it without trading in Tea. Great, I've already hit the cap. I don't exactly need the Tea trading buff. In general, it's not awful. There are worse trade goods, but it's not nice overall. And I find that the minus 10% advisor cost, while in theory is quite a nice buff to have, by the time you're actually trading in it, it's just whatever. For that reason, Tea for me is going to be going in C tier, and this does hurt me, saying that given that I live in the UK. From that point, however, moving on to Cocoa, or chocolate. Starting at 4 ducats and ending at 5.4, it's amazing. There's no two ways around it. The manufacturing for it is Tech 14, so that's nice. It starts above average, ends above average. It's just an excellent trade good to have. It also gives you some really nice modifiers. 10% local manpower is actually useful, because normally you just want more manpower to have, and you don't... Well, 10% global manpower would be nice. 10% local manpower just helps you get more manpower, for lack of a better word. And the final finisher for it, 5% manpower recovery speed, is excellent. You're going to recover your manpower faster, which is useful for both single player and multiplayer. It's just an amazing trade good all around. Cocoa is consistently an A tier for me. There's not too much debate there. It's just a good trade good. You're not going to be having a campaign around it, but it's there, certainly. Next, we move on to coffee, starting at 3 ducats, jumping around a bit, and ending up at 3.3. It's okay in terms of its value. You have to play around the coffee Arabica event quite a bit because that can tend to devastate your coffee prices. Otherwise, it's reasonable on the value. The province gets 10% institution spread. That's honestly whatever. Institution spread isn't that big of a deal. You can realistically just wait a couple more months. Usually it's not the end of the world. And if you can't afford to wait, go take a loan. And if you can't take a loan because you're going to be near bankruptcy, then you probably shouldn't be worried about embracing the institution. Coffee also gives you plus 5% local institution spread. Again, sorry, plus 5% global institution spread when you're trading in it, which is, again, whatever. You're spreading the institution a bit better. It's nice that it's global, so you can get it in every other province. But 5% is such a pathetic amount that if you really want 5% global institution spread, just be at peace. That's plus 10 right there. And there's a whole bunch of other ways of getting institution spread that don't involve trading in coffee. It's not a useless modifier, but it's pretty much close to it. It's not completely negligible like Spy Defense and Monthly Devastation for 95% of the game. And coffee also doesn't make up for it with excellent trade value. It has a bit of a spike where it becomes reasonable. And for that reason, I'm going to be putting coffee in B tier. But it's only just there in B tier because of its reasonable trade price. It's being carried entirely by its value. With that said and done, we move on to cotton. Starts at 3, ends at 4.95. Cotton is an excellent trade good late game. It's a decent trade good late game, and it's just consistently nice. For me, mentally, it's in the same category as your cloth, because it has the minus 10% dev cost. So if you're playing in India or places that also have a lot of cotton, for example, Anatolia has a couple cotton provinces, something you should bear in mind for that dev cost reduction. That can be quite nice. The problem with that I have with cotton is the trading in buff, 20 global settlers. That buff would be amazing if you're playing England. It'll be amazing if you're playing Spain. It'll be amazing if you're playing Portugal. It'll be amazing if you're playing countries that don't have access to cotton. That does mean that countries like Britain have a side buff of being able to conquer India and getting their cotton for global settlers that way. Or if you're playing as Castile and decide to restore the Roman Empire and conquer into Anatolia, you'll probably be able to trade in cotton that way. Although, again, it'd be quite difficult, but you might be able to get trading in cotton that way to get a bit more global settlers. But if you're playing Spain and conquering the Ottomans, you're probably not in that much of a need for 20 global settlers anyway. It's a very strong buff. It's just very hard to get for the countries that could actually use it. Countries that can also trade in cotton are India. They tend to not colonize so much, unless you got Australia. And again, Ottomans do a lot of things, but colonization is not one of them. So you end up with a weird situation where you have a quite nice modifier they don't end up using. Regardless of that, it's still a strong modifier that you just usually don't have access to, as in you're the country that's not using it, so I can't really mark it down for that. A minus 10% dev cost on the province is just wonderful. On its own, that it basically makes it draw with cloth in terms of having something nice to dev on it. Cotton sits very comfortably in A tier for me. I'm going to put it just above cloth as well, because I think it's slightly better. The thing is, with cloth, there's just more of it than cotton around. But that's about that. With that being said and done with cotton, we now move on to sugar. Sugar is a money, it's a cash crop thing. The modifiers you get on it are whatever. You get -1 on rest, same as wine on the province level. You get minus 20% cost reducing war exhaustion when you're trading in it, which can be situationally reasonable. Like, if you really have high war exhaustion because you're death warring the entire world and you're truce breaking everyone and you're single player, then I guess that's okay. But bear in mind that when you're doing that, you probably have absolutism, and decreasing war exhaustion reduces your absolutism, so you have to be careful doing that. Or, multiplayer, in which case, sure, you're probably not caring about absolutism as much, but at the same time, the absolutism still affects you, and the 20% reduction in war exhaustion, while can help you fight a bit longer, you're going to run out of dip anyway, it's not free. So they're both kind of meh, situationally reasonable buffs on the per province and trading in level. However, sugar still delivers on the price point of view. Starting at 3 ducats is certainly not bad. Well, it's below average, but it's not bad like things that are 2 ducats, as I've said before. And ending at 5.25 is well above average. It's just an excellent cash crop all around. For that reason alone, I'm going to be putting sugar into B tier. It's just nice to have, but it's not something to write home about. After that, we move on to tobacco, one of the greatest evils that we have managed to extract out of the New World. Starting, however, that evil begins at 3 ducats, and it ends up at 4.5. Its modifiers are whatever. You get 25% spy defense, much like Vice's. Great. What a useful modifier. And it gives you 10% trade power on the province as well. It's not bad like first, but the modifiers are not too great as well. The final price of it becomes 4.5, which makes it reasonable. And, well, above average and quite good in the late game, to be clear, not reasonable. I'm being a bit harsh. And the 3 ducat starting price means it's not bad when you do discover it. So tobacco all around is reasonable. And for that reasonable title, it's going to be going into B tier. Not anywhere specific, we'll put it around here near the middle. Next we move on to dies. They start at 4 ducats, they end at 4 ducats. There's some uniform regulations, and then there's a wide availability of dies that kind of change that. The thing with dies that's worth mentioning is the manufacturer 4 dies is available earlier at 11, Tech 11, which is weird because most of the manufacturers that are actually good to build are available from Tech 14 and 16. Dies is a Tech 11 manufacturer, much like something like iron and copper as well, so that's nice. Dies gives you 10% local trade power. The thing is with that Dies local trade power is dies tend to be concentrated in provinces where you tend to contest trade power. Namely, there's a bunch of die provinces in the Persia area, which is an inland place where you probably want trade power. And there's a couple die provinces in Germany where you want the trade power because you're in inland nodes trying to contest your trade power and protect it from the likes of England and France trying to steal it. So that trade power ends up being situationally a bit better, but at the end of the day, 10% trade power is having a more useful modifier having a modifier that's more useful in an area is good. The issue is that a weak modifier that's more useful in an area still keeps it at weak. And that's my issue with 10% trade power. It's just nice, but it's not that great. The trading in buff is honestly whatever, 32% chance of new air, really. I think they just ran out of things to give for the trade good modifiers, 32% chance of new air. If you're really worried about chance of new air, go play a Sunni so you have 100% from being Sunni. Otherwise, it's pretty useless. I mean, if you're Christian, it can help you avoid a PU. But yeah. The thing with dies though that keeps it consistently nice and consistently good is it starts at 4 ducats and it pretty much stays at 4 ducats. It does drop below a bit and then recovers back to 4 ducats. So even in the late game, it's a good trade value. It's a great trade good for money. And it's a great trade good right at the start of the game when you need that money. And its manufacturer is available really early. For me, what that means with dies is that actually puts up to A tier because it gives you, it's a good value trade good with meh modifiers, but it's good value trade good when you want that money. Right at the start of the game, it's giving you those 4 ducats. Right in the early game when you're just doing your scaling, it's giving you those 11. It's giving you that Tech 11 manufacturer. Just nothing to complain about dies in terms of the money it provides. With that said, we then move on to Silk. Silk starts at 4 ducats and goes to 5. It gives you +2 local trade power on the actual province when you have the Silk, which is great. And it is also a Tech 11 manufacturer, which is again absolutely nice. The trading buff on it is +1 max promoted cultures. Honestly, everything there is just useful. Max promoted cultures are useful in multiplayer because you're able to accept more cultures and get more manpower and money out of them. And guess what? The exact same logic applies in single player, but it also means that those max promoted cultures are a bit less likely to revolt when you've got 3000% overextension. The money from it starts good at 4, it goes up to 5, so it becomes even more amazing. Honestly, dies, if it wasn't for gold existing, Silk, if it wasn't for gold existing, it would probably go on top of A tier on its own. It's not quite gameplay defining as the S tiers that we're going to get into. However, Silk consistently for me sits in A tier. With that being said and done, Tropical Wood starts at 2 goes to 3. This is a trade good that is carried very heavily by one thing and one thing only, its modifiers. So 2 means it's below average. Going up to 3, it's still not great, but it's just consistently below value. There's only one price jump for it, that 2 to 3 price jump when you figure out that cabinets exist. It's got a very late manufacturing at Tech 16, so it's just not great for money. However, with Tropical Wood, the provinces that do have it get minus 20% construction costs, meaning that those manufacturers that you end up building, or the workshops, or the temples, or whatever you end up building on it, end up cheaper, and that's just good. In essence, it means that the initial investment to get your return on money is better with Tropical Wood provinces. So that's an important thing to bear in mind. That is just a very nice per province modifier that decreases construction cost. And the trading in buff in it is just either amazing or good. It's minus 5 dev cost. In multiplayer, minus 5 dev cost is just amazing. It helps you scale better. It's one of the things that you look for in multiplayer countries when you're looking at their ideas is do they have dev cost reduction. And Tropical Wood gives you that minus 5% dev cost. Just there you go, have it. Not as great as minus 10% dev cost, but it's still very good. In single player, minus 5% dev cost also goes in a very important direction when you're deving your institutions. In single player, you're probably going to be deving your institutions, if not all of them, at least a decent chunk of them. And that minus 5% dev cost is going to save you a bunch of monarch points. Now, if you look at those monarch points spread out throughout the entire campaign, it's not going to be that big of a deal. The thing with deving institutions is it demands an upfront payment of monarch points. See, if you could just give minus 1 admin, minus 1 dip, minus 1 mil to the game and say, okay, I have the institution buffs now, that would not be as bad as needing to dev the institution and then wait for it to spread before you can embrace it. Because you are demanding those monarch points up front. And that's the thing with that minus 5 dev cost. For when you're deving those institutions, you're decreasing the upfront requirement of monarch points to get the institution. And for that reason, I'm going to value it quite nicely. My issue with Tropical Wood, again, however, is its abysmal return on investments on its starting price and final tier. I think that's really what's holding back Tropical Wood. If there was some kind of country that would be played in Malaya and have some missions to increase the Tropical Wood price locally, or something like that, I think it would be a lot better. But for that reason alone, even though the buffs for trading in it are great, Tropical Wood is one of those things that you steal trade value of, and then you conquer to get a trading in it buff. But it's not really something that is just good to have yourself. So for that reason, I'm going to be putting it at the top of C tier. Yeah, I don't think it quite breaks into B tier for me. It's just below things like iron and copper for me, and things like salt and porcelain. I'm sorry. Then we move on to incense. Incense is a weird one. Starts at 2.5, goes to 3, so it again does not deliver on the front of the value for money. You get 10% trade value, you get 0.5 tolerance of true faith. Now, I've been quite harsh to the wine's minus 1 unrest. 0.5 tolerance of true faith is even worse than minus 1 unrest, because it's basically 0.5 unrest, but only on true faith provinces. 10% trade value isn't awful, but it's not great either. And while incense does go up significantly and then dip back down again, it's not a good trade good all around as well. It's still consistently below average. For me, I'm never happy with it, but it could be worse is the best way of summarizing incense, and the best way of summarizing something that could be better, but it's not the worst, is C tier, which is where incense is going to be going. Definitely below wheat, though, but above wine. Although, do I say it's above wine? I mean, is it really? Honestly, no. No, it's not. I think wine is just better. It ends up trading for a bit more money, and while I technically would value the incense 10% trade value more than I would value the wine, the issue with the incense 10% local trade value is that it's nice for generating trade value, sure. But generating trade value on a province that doesn't have a lot of trade value anyway. So it's kind of self-nerfing in that regard. Next, to move on to the class of what I like to call the three trade goods that have the state house manufactories: your glass, your paper, your gems. These are the wonderful things to build your state houses on. That makes them a lot better, so for that reason alone, they are quite valuable. Glass starts at 3. It has a lot of price value increases, but then it dips quite big when flint-lead glass gets invented. A lot of countries have glass-based pastries. Your Bohemia gets Bohemian crystal. Your Venice gets your buffs to glass. And the other thing with glass is it's very concentrated. There's a province of it in Africa. The rest of the glass lives in Europe. And that makes a lot of historical sense. If you ever wondered, oh, so we import like China ware from China. We import ivory from Africa. We import all these colonial goods like coffee and sugar and tobacco from the Americas. What does Europe provide to the world? Honestly, wine and glass. That's the two European things. That's what we have going for us. Alcoholism. Somehow that makes me very proud saying that. Unfortunately, while glass does get a large increase in trade value, starts at 3 and just goes up, it does dip by the end game. Again, that 3 trade value is a bit disingenuous to it because, again, it jumps for quite a significant portion of that quite high up. Gives you 10% local production efficiency, which means you're making even more money on a decent trade good for money. The trading and buffing is whatever dip tech costs. I mean, it's good for exactly 1 tech when you're trying to get the Imperialism tech. Otherwise, it's whatever. It does add up over time. It saves you a bit of dip points depending on how early you start trading in glass over the course of the campaign. But it's monarch points spread out, so I'm going to value it a bit less than the dev cost. Regardless of all that, it's just consistently very nice. And that's the best way of thinking about glass. As far as trade goods go, it's just a nice trade good consistently to have. For that reason, I'm going to be putting it basically at the top levels of B tier. I don't think it's quite as good as iron or copper, but it's definitely up there and it's definitely above salt. With that being said, we then move on to paper. Woo, paper. What a trade good. Oof. That's a lot of talking today. Now, with paper, it starts at 3.5 ducats. Again, well above average at this point. I'm always happy when I see paper. And it goes to 4.725. It's a wonderful trade good in terms of its final price. It does have a big decrease when there's when you get the industrialization events. However, it recovers anyway, and the thing with paper is it goes up quite early. Administrating an empire knocks it up to a 4.25 trade good, making it one of the best trade goods to find inside of Europe normally, excluding gems, which we'll get to in a bit. So if you're playing in Europe, paper is your nice trade good to grab. It's going to stay at 4.25 for quite a bit after administrating an empire, and it's going to fluctuate to a bit as well, but it's not going to be that big of a deal. With paper, you get -10 in local state maintenance. That's one of the least whatever modifiers you can get out of one of these ones. Doesn't give you much money, but the finisher's -5 admin tech cost. It gets you the ideas fast if you're going for it. Otherwise, it's not that big of a deal as well. However, it's consistently good for money. You've got good manufacturers to build state houses on. It's just a very nice trade good. For that reason, and because it is even more money than glass, I'm actually going to be putting it into A tier. I don't think it's as good as something like Dice, but I'm going to still value it quite highly. I think it consistently makes A tier, especially with state houses taken into account. With that being said, we move on to gems. Gems start at 4 ducats, and they start at 4 ducats right away, so your Konigsbergs, your Golconda Diamond Mines, your Constantinople, if you get faceting there, are going to be excellent. And then it gets even better because it goes to 5 when fasting gets invented. Gems will be a good way of defining your economy in the early game if you play in a province that has a gem province. Unfortunately, we're going to then go ahead and do this thing called colonization, and we're going to find gems in the Americas and all those places. And that's going to crash their price down from 5 to 3. And that's going to make them quite a bit sadder. They're not going to be useless. The thing with gems is 3 isn't never bad, but it's below average compared to all the other trade goods at this point, and that's what makes it quite sad. It's just a reasonable trade good to have. Gems really shine in the early game, and because they shine in the early game, I think that that's worth quite a lot, because that's when you really need the money. The thing with popping off quite badly in the late game, well, not popping off, but becoming quite worse in the late game, to be clear, sorry, is that at that point, you're probably not building the manufacture on them for the goods produced, because you are getting your 3 ducats out of it. There's better places to build those manufactories. With gems, however, you're able to build the state houses, which are much more effective. With a manufactory for gems also requiring admin 16, is it admin 16? It might be div 16. I think it's admin 16 though. Well, it's tech 16 nonetheless. Gems are going to be definitely a 3 ducats at that point, is what I'm going to say. The buffs from them, from a promise level, is also quite nice. 15% local tax, again, quite helps in the early game. It's not as good as a temple, but it works still with a temple. So again, it lets you get more money out of the gem promises as well. And trading in it never hurts. Minus 0.05 yearly inflation reduction allows you to counteract the inflation you get either from taking loans, which you should be doing, or, the inflation reduction that you get from gold, which again, you're probably going to have a couple of gold provinces if you go for the world conquest. Even then, if you don't have gold provinces, it's still going to be useful because you're probably going to be taking loans. So 0.05 yearly inflation reduction is just a nice thing to have. Gems are just consistently nice, and they're amazing in the early game when they're trading at 5 ducats right off the bat. It's something you can build an economy around. I'm not going to be putting it as high as cocoa, but I think it's, or even the other trade goods, but I think gems and paper are pretty contestable. In fact, I'm going to put gems above paper. So I'm going to put above paper. There we go. Simply because of how much value they provide in the early game for you. You can genuinely build an economy around them. And with that, we're left with the last true trade goods and an entire S tier that's not been filled out. I think it's going to put no surprise to anyone that we're going to be putting coal into the S tier. Coal behaves on its own, much like gold. It's its own little mini trade good. Demands a special thing. It doesn't really get a manufacturing tech. Furnaces are available from, I believe, tech 21 or 23. The issue is that at Tech 21 and 23, you still can't build them, because you need the Enlightenment to be present in the coal province to build the furnace manufactory for it. It doesn't give you goods produced on it, but it gives you 5% goods produced everywhere else. Coal is the single strongest late game economic buff, simply because of the furnace you can build on it. 5% goods produced makes everything better by 5%. Your trade value goes up by 5%, and your production income goes up by 5%. Nothing to complain about there. It's pretty much amazing. It also starts at 10 ducats. It's not the best trade good for money, if you're looking at pure trade value. The thing is with 10 ducats is while it starts at 10, it quite quickly dips down with the proliferation of gold back down to 7, which down to 7 makes it sound quite bad, but 7 is still pretty much the second best trade good. third best if you're including gold, but second best if you're looking at it from a trade value point of view. So there's nothing to complain about there. The local province buff is whatever, minus 20 local state maintenance is the largest state maintenance you're going to get, but it's a big decrease on, what, 30 ducats when you stated the entire world? Yeah, I think I'll be fine. But the trading in a buff is, again, amazing. It's basically 2 more furnaces, 10% goods produced modifier. With the reason it's an ST is you can genuinely make a playthrough around coal. England gets coal early if you want to experiment with it that way, but once you do get coal from the Enlightenment in the 1700s, you're able to get genuinely insane amounts of wealth just by building your furnaces if you've been conquering Europe or you've been conquering other coal-rich areas. Europe is pretty much the place to be for coal though, but it is what it is. So coal again is a playthrough defining trade good. People will be marking coal earlier down there, well, lower down because you don't get coal until the Enlightenment. My complaint is that having it a lower tier when you don't have access to a trade good is not really a fair comparison, because at that point you don't have access to a trade good. That's like playing as France and putting silk in D tier because, well, I don't have access to silk as France. Great, that doesn't make the trade good inherently worse. There is the time value function of money that you have to take into account. Yes, coal makes you a lot more money in the late game when you already have a lot more money, but one of the reasons that you have a lot more money in the end game is because of coal. So it's one of the reasons that the time value function of money is so disproportionately weighted towards having earlier income, because coal produces just so much money on its own from furnaces that it inflates, for lack of a better word, the value of money in the late game. It makes it less relevant. And with that, we move on to the final trade good, cloves. No price change events. It's 8 ducats, it's going to stay 8 ducats, and that's amazing. Until the end of the game, it's going to be when gold goes from 10 to 7, and if you exclude gold, it's the best trade good individually for money, and it is just consistent. It's going to be 8 ducats. There's going to be big explosions. Wheat is going to go down price by 75% for 2 years. Cloves does not care. It's going to be 8 ducats. It's going to start at 8. It's going to be at 8. It's just good. It's just all around amazing trade good. And the thing with it is that at 8 trade good value, what you end up getting is that if you end up collecting your trade, you're generating 8 value from production. You're generating 8 value from trade. Notice how gold doesn't generate that 40 ducats in terms of the trade value. Cloves does. What that means is that your 8 trade value becomes, if you're also getting the trade, your 8 production value combines with the 8 trade value. So you end up getting 16 ducats of, well, actual income from it, as long as you're getting the trade. But this 16 ducats is something that's affected by production efficiency, something that's affected by trade efficiency, which shoots it up the score. And once you take into account that you don't have to babysit cloves, in the same way you have to babysit cloves with your inflation same way you have to babysit gold with your inflation reductions, you don't have to babysit it in terms of having it deplete. Cloves don't deplete. I'd actually argue that cloves is just better than gold, especially once you start taking into account its buff. 20% local trade power, again, isn't great, but it's a substantial help to retain your, well, trade of cloves. And a plus 5% trade efficiency on the trading in buff, it's one of the nicer things to get, because trade efficiency, buffs to it, is how you make money in the end game. And that's where cloves help you. It's just great all around. For that reason, and the fact that you can literally make playthroughs around cloves, I'm going to be putting it into the S tier as well. But that, however, does conclude, well, the tier list. As you can see, we've put everything there. I would say that you can go tell me your opinion in the comments, but there's not much point saying that because you're going to go do that anyway. Thank you very much for watching to the end of the video. I hope you enjoyed, and I hope you learned something new today. With that being said and done, thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye.